Hello everyone, C's here, and today we're going to prove that the following are tautologies by using rules of deduction. So let's go ahead and get started. First off, let's start off with this one. Okay, so we want to prove that if P implies Q, then P implies P and Q would be true, right? Let me get need a pen. Need a pen. Hopefully this is a good pen. Okay. So what we're proving, starting off with the given statement here, P implies Q implies that this would be true, which is that P would imply P and Q. Okay. So first thing, since this is just an implication, we want to, whenever you see something like this, we want to start off with an assumption. So we're going to start off with the assumption that P implies Q is true. Now we don't know whether that is true or not, but we're just going to go assume that it's true and see what we get from that. Now if P implies Q is true, then what we want to get to eventually is, let's write it around here, we want to finish off with P implies P and Q. So let's go ahead and imply, well, let's write it here. We're going to write this is an assumption. Let's make another assumption that P is true. And so then this is another assumption. Now what can we do from here? What we want to get to is that we've assumed this part. We want to get to this part. So how do we get that? If P is true, then obviously we can just say that P is true. And let's just say copy. Let's number these, right? This is 1, 2, 3. So copy line 2. And if P is true, since we're under this assumption, we know that Q would also be true. And so that would be, from our rules of deduction, that modus ponens with line 1, right? Because we know P is true, therefore Q must be true. Now we have both of these, so what can we do? Let's do an and introduction, or yeah, I think. And intro lines 3 and 4. So well, we already have this part. We've assumed that P is true, and we've deduced that P and Q would that we can get P and Q resulting from the assumption that P is true. So from this, under this assumption, we can step out and say that P implies P and Q. And that would be if then intro lines 2 and 5. Now what? We're under this assumption, and as you can see, we kind of already reached what we wanted, right? So we can say under this assumption that if P implies Q is true, we can derive P would imply P and Q. And from this P implies Q, we can derive that P implies P and Q is true. So this is number 6 and also number 6. So from under this, regardless of whether this is true or false, we know that if it were true, we can derive that P implies Q would imply that P implies P and Q. So we're done. This would be and intro, lines 1 and 6. And we're done. Not too bad. Now let's do the next one. Let's do this one. Now this one is going to be a little more interesting. We have that, I want to start off with, I want to prove a biconditional statement. So we're going to have to do kind of what we did before with the assumption, then deriving to the end part here. And then we're going to do it backwards as well. Okay, so let's just start off and let's do step number 1. First, we are going to assume that P is true. Okay, then what? We want to get to this second half part. How can we do that? Well, if P, under our assumption, if P is true, then we have that P is obviously true. So we can just copy line 1. And if P is true, we have to somehow get this or P and Q part. How could we do that? Well, it seems tricky, but it's really just a simple step. Because if P is true, then P or anything else would also be true. Right? We could put A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you know. In this case, we can just introduce P and Q. That would be or intro with line 2. And the reason is, if P is true, it doesn't really matter what we put over here, right? We could put P or A or B or C or anything else, and it would still be true. So from there, we've deduced that we can get this part, and so we can step out and say that regardless whether P is true or false, we know that if it were true, we can get that P or P and Q would be true. And that would be conditional introduction, lines 1 and 3. Okay, so we did this first half. Now we have to go from here going backwards. So let's do, on our second part of our proof here, we're going to assume that P or P and Q is true. Okay. And then we want to get to just P. Now, how can we do that? We have an OR, and it's pretty tempting to just do like a OR elimination there, but kind of like we did with this OR introduction, but it's not going to work. We have to be more careful when it comes to doing elimination with OR. But if we do know under this assumption that the whole statement is true, so one of these or both are true. So what we have to do is a case analysis. And so let's just let's go ahead and assume that P is true, this left half. And like we did before, if P is true, obviously P is true. Which is that's our assumption. This is just copying line 6. And so obviously P implies P. And this would be just a note here. This is case 1. And so if case 1 is true, P implies P is true. Now let's do the second half. What if this part is true? P and Q is true. That would be our second case. And that's our assumption. Now if that's true, we know they're both true, so we can just say P is true. And that's a and elimination. And Q is also true, which is an and elimination. Okay. So if P and Q is true, we can say, we don't really need this Q part. We know that if P and Q were true, it would imply that P is true. So that's conditional introduction, line 9 and 10. Okay. Now, from our case 1, it followed that P would be true, and if case 2 is true, it would also mean that P is true. So regardless of whether this half or this half was true, or both, we know that no matter what, it would be that P would be true. So we can say here, stepping out of, hold on, where are we? This is this assumption, step out, this assumption, step out. So from here, regardless if P or P and Q is true, that would imply that P is true. And that would be conditional intro, lines, actually no, that's case analysis. Case analysis, lines 8 and 12. Let's write that here, 8 and 12. So for our final step, that's when we do we're going to do the biconditional now because we've reached the two big ones that we want. We reached this statement going this way and the statement from before going that way. So finally we have proved that this is a tautology, meaning it's always true. So P or P and Q. So P if and only if P or P and Q. It's a biconditional introduction, line 4 and 13. Nice. Not bad. Now, let's move on to the next one. And see what we have here. This one looks tricky. There's a lot going on here. So we have if P implies R is true, then this whole statement would be true, which is that if Q implies R, then it would follow that P or Q would imply R. There's a lot of conditionals there, so it's going to get us used to how to prove these conditionals. So let's get started here. First thing we want to prove is probably this outermost one. Let's write it. I'm going to copy that down. P implies R implies that Q implies R would imply that P or Q imply R. So another one there. So what I like to do is really get these parentheses all grouped up so we can see exactly what we're dealing with, right? So this is like a little packet here, this outer packet, and I think I have an extra one. Let me see. Close, I think, because yeah, I need another one. Yeah, I need another one. Like that, like that. So we can see is that the main one that we're trying to get is this first conditional. So what we're going to assume is this first part, that P implies R. And what we want to get to is this final outer one. Now, in order to get this outer one, we're going to have to basically do the same thing, and we're going to assume this one now. So we're always assuming the first part of the conditional statement that we're trying to prove. First we did the most outer one, then we're stepping into the second part that we're trying to prove here, and go to that the first half of the conditional there. So we're going to go and assume that Q implies R is true. And once we have that, what we want to eventually get to is that this outer statement is true. But as you can see, we have another conditional. So let's go ahead and nest ourselves in deeper and assume that P or Q is true. Okay, so we first did, this is 1 right here. This is 2 and 3. And they're all assumptions. And that just means the same thing. Okay. Now, what can we do to get, we want to get first, going backwards now, we want to get this. And so we can say that P or Q is true, and we want to get R. Okay, so how can we do that? Okay, so let's go ahead and assume, first off, let's assume that Q is true. And so Q would give us R according to line 2. Right? Because if Q is true, R is true according to this assumption. And that would be modus ponens, line 2. Excellent. So we have if Q is true, this would be case 1 technically too. It's 1. And so we know that Q implies R, which we've kind of already stated here, so we don't really have to say that. But let's just say it anyways, being a little redundant. This is conditional introduction 4 and 5. But it's really just copied over from 2 as well. So anyways, let's move on to the other case, which is if P is true, then from line 1 we have that R is true. Sorry, this is assumption. We have to write down why we did things. And this is modus ponens. Line 1. Well, line 1 and 7. And then back over here, this would be modus ponens lines 2 and 4. Okay, so we know that if P were true, we can get to R. So this is and introduction, line 7 and 8. And then I like to make these little columns so I know exactly where I'm at. So regardless of the case, whether Q was true or P was true, or if they're both true, we know that R is true regardless. So we can just write R here and say this is a case analysis. Lines 6 and 9. And then we've reached from P or Q that R is true. So we can step out of this little line here and say if P or Q is true, it would imply that R is true. And look at that. We've proven this little part right here. And that would be and intro lines, what lines are those? 3 and 10. Excellent. Next. So let's see, we're under this assumption, and we've reached that Q implies R. We can reach that P or Q implies R. So we've basically got this part, running out of space there. So we can say outside of this statement, because regardless of whether it's true or not, we know that if it were true, we can reach it. We can deduce that. Okay, so that's an and intro with 2 and 11. Perfect. And then for that last part, to get this outer piece, we've basically reached that if P implies R is true, we can reach this entire thing. We can deduce that entire thing. So outside of this nested statement, we can say that if P implies R is true, it would imply that this whole big statement is true. Let's make another one there. Q, R implies that P or Q implies R is true. I think I need another one. Close, close. Yeah, right there. That's it. We're done. And of course we have to say what we did. That's a and intro, line 1 and 12. Excellent. We have proven that these three, in the order that we did them, we have proven that these three are tautologies by using rules of deduction. Not too bad. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know.